Hey and welcome, I'm Hammeh, and in my ongoing exploration of everything Overwatch lore and story related, it's time to take a look once more at skins. Many of Overwatch's skins have rich historic or cultural references behind them that give a lot of background and talking points to the lore and stories of our favourite heroes and villains. Some are canon and directly show us things about the characters, most very much aren't, but either way they have awesome details that I'll be explaining and exploring in this series. In this video I'll be taking a look at the story and history behind some of Reaper's Overwatch skins, Nevermore and Plague Doctor specifically. We'll be explaining a bit about the background of Edgar Allen Poe, the significance of his famous poem The Raven, both the poem and the creature itself, and how the themes of ravens and indeed plague doctors in both of his skins could fit in quite nicely with Reaper's story that we know so far. So firstly, where is the background behind Nevermore and Plague Doctor coming from? Well, for Nevermore it's pretty straightforward to start with. Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven is a famous poem from the early 19th century American author and poet. You'll recognise many of the lines. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. Only this and nothing more. Ah, distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow. Vainly I had sought to borrow from my books a cease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. That's the famous beginning to the poem. First published in 1845, it tells of a talking raven's mysterious visit to a distraught lover. The man, lamenting the loss of his love, Lenore, as I've said, attempts to reason with a raven that enters his chamber and sits on a bust of Pallas there, Athena, a goddess of heroic endeavour in Greek tradition. Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a saintly raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, nor a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady, perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bus of Pallas, just above my chamber door, perched and sat and nothing more. The raven seems to further instigate his distress with its constant repetition thereafter of the word nevermore to every single question the man asks. Even though the man actually believes this bird can utter no other word, he attempts to reason with it anyway. And this slow self-deprecation, with the man even asking the raven whether he'll be reunited with Lenore in heaven, only to be answered nevermore, appears to take its toll as he slowly descends into madness, with the man seemingly obsessed and feeling trapped by the raven's presence in this last verse. And the raven never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door, and his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor, and my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. So forgive me the slight little dramatic reading of a few verses there, but I think it gives context to the whole poem, and some of the things we'll talk about as to how this could fit in with Reaper and ravens later. The poem's main theme is of undying devotion. The narrator is conflicted between wanting to forget Lenore and a desire to remember her and a hope of seeing her again, be it in this life in some spectral form or the next. The poem uses a number of folk, mythological, religious and classical references like the Pallas bust, the narrator's belief that the raven is actually, in one verse, from the night's Plutonian shore, refers to the raven potentially being a messenger from the afterlife, referring to Pluto, the Roman god of the underworld. Now, this poem is actually a heck of a lot longer than the few little verses I've read. It's quite repetitive, so its literary value in terms of how it's constructed has been questioned sometimes, but it's certainly a very famous poem that has been quoted and referenced in all kinds of things ever since. Books, TV, films, you name it, but we'll get on to those later. Okay, next up, Plague Doctors. Well, as for Reaper's Plague Doctor skin, although it's a recolour alternative version of Nevermore, it too has an interesting background that ties into the story of Gabriel Reyes and could hint upon aspects of his story as well. European Plague Doctors certainly date back to bubonic plagues of the mid-6th century, perhaps, or earlier. However, the most famous plague was probably the Black Death in Europe in the 14th century. The Plague Doctor costume was invented perhaps as early as the 1400s, but had become more commonplace by the 1600s. The heavy waxed overcoat, the mask that looks bird or raven-like with glass eye openings, and the beak-shaped nose. Stuffed with herbs, straw and spices, it was actually thought at the time that this would protect the Doctor from bad air or miasma. This was kind of a medical theory at the time, but given that bacteria were most probably the actual source and the most likely transmission vector were flea bites, this would have probably been of limited effectiveness. Although the coat would have been a shield against biting fleas and exposure, perhaps a lucky choice of herbs that repelled fleas as well as limiting exposure to patients, plague doctors would often use sticks or canes to examine patients from distance whilst wearing gloves rather than checking them by touching them. All of these things would have certainly helped some. So what interesting parallels are there between the story and imagery of the Raven, Plague Doctors, and that of Gabriel Reyes? Well, firstly with Nevermore and the Raven. Reaper is a man of shifting sort of form and also shifting morality, it seems, in terms of his story, and there is somewhat of a parallel with the depiction of the Raven in mythology. Now, the Raven itself is a bird and a symbol because of its black plumage, croaking call and diet of carrion, has been thought of a bird of ill omen as a result to many cultures. As it sits on this border between life and death through its diet, it has associations with the dead and indeed lost souls. Jumping over to Reaper, well, Reaper's actually meant to sort of somewhat suck the life energy out of people somehow in his bio, until of course his recent PTR changes, maybe removing his soul globes altogether. From Reaper's bio, the few bodies recovered of those he kills are pale empty husks drained of life, their cells showing signs of intense degradation. Survivors have described a black shadow ghosting unscathed through the most hellish battlefields. You're certainly going to see a bunch of ravens or crow-type birds on battlefields eating at carrion and sadly corpses. Now, there are two sides to the depiction of ravens, actually. They do somewhat have a light and good association further in the past as well. In Greek mythology, they were associated with Apollo, god of prophecy, and actually a symbol of luck, the god's messengers in the mortal world. A white raven was actually sent by Apollo to spy on his lover, and the poor raven was actually scorched black by him in his fury when it returned with, shall we say, unwelcome news on her loyalty. So that's the little story to the Greeks of how ravens became black. In various Christian stories to do with saints, we have ravens protecting the bodies of saints from being eaten once they died, and similar things as well. So ravens do have a positive association in some Christian stories. Now, Reaper has two sides to him too. He did have a positive side to him that we shouldn't forget. He did command the original Overwatch strike team, he was firm friends at one point with Jack Morrison. However, it then kind of all changed after the Omnic Crisis seemingly ended, if not before. He lost out on command of Overwatch, and indeed second in command of Overwatch, to Morrison and Omari, being instead made head of Blackwatch, Overwatch's covert operations unit. Even though that this happened, we don't know what happened throughout the almost 2 decades of peace that Overwatch brought to the world. Even in the events of Uprising, we still see Reaper, or Reyes as he was then, looking somewhat cheery. Even if he is being a little bit sarcastic and uncooperative, he's sort of telling Morrison that the things that McCree is up to in London, he doesn't really need to know. Now, whether Reyes was up to no good or not at this point with Blackwatch, we don't exactly know right now the timings. However, given Anna's reaction to taking his mask off in Old Soldiers, and the way that Reyes looks in Uprising, at this point, whatever turned him into Reaper probably has not happened yet. So, like the lover descended into madness in the Raven, has Reaper perhaps descended into the madness of revenge, perhaps driven by whatever caused him to become Reaper, and also perhaps loss as well? Now, we see the madness or descent into madness of Reyes in Old Soldiers, Reaper wanting the revenge on soldiers in Switzerland, calling on Anna to acknowledge that she was left to die by Overwatch, and that he blames a similar he and they for his suffering. In Reflections, we perhaps see, like in the Raven poem, the lost side coming into play. We do see Reaper gazing upon a family. Now, could this be his equivalent of a lost lover, or his daughter, or family even? Remember that Reyes would probably be in his 50s now to guess, so it all depends on whether you think maybe this is his wife and children, or perhaps his grandchildren, as to how old you think the woman is in this picture. In another neat interpretative twist of the Raven imagery, some natives of the North American Pacific Northwest portray the Raven as both being a creator of the world and also a trickster god as well. In fact, multiple ravens in some of these cultures can stand for these different things. Now, I quite like that. It's a bit of a stretch, but it's kind of neat. Reyes helped create Overwatch, so he was one of the creators, perhaps, of this sort of story. However, towards the end, maybe he was playing both sides. We don't know right now. We do know that there were factions within Blackwatch who sought to bring down Overwatch and turn it to their own ends. We don't know Reyes' involvement in that or not at this point. But for now, he's certainly something darker in form or spirit. Now, how about Plague Doctor? Well, if you say that the Raven kind of reflects on Reaper's personality, perhaps the Plague Doctor element of the skin reflects more on Reaper's current situation. Now, Plague Doctors were seen as very valuable. They could be given unique privileges, like being able to autopsy bodies. Remember, in medieval Europe, this kind of treatment of the body after death in the Christian culture of the time was seen as being pretty heretical. However, these privileges, if you can call them those, came very much at a cost. Plague Doctors very often couldn't interact with the general public because of the nature of their work. They were seen as symbols of fear wherever they went because people thought that they brought death with them or that death was going to come to whoever they visited. And also, they kept away from people sometimes to avoid the possibility of spreading the disease that they dealt with every day. In certain places, Plague Doctors could also be subjected to be isolated, put in quarantine as well. So, Plague Doctors doing the, to some, distasteful yet very necessary work, having special privileges and leeway to do so outside of the rules or the common conceptions of the time, and being isolated as a result of this, the Plague Doctor's life could be said to me to be very much comparable to Reyes' life in Blackwatch, the little of it that we know of so far. Now, of course, if the Raven as an animal sees the borders of life and death every day, so a Plague Doctor, of course, would have done so too. And Reyes may very well have had to do and perhaps seen some terrible things in his tenure of Blackwatch as well. Okay, we've learnt about the shared history behind the Nevermore and Plague Doctor themed skins and how they might tie into the story of Gabriel Reyes and Reaper. Finally, for a little bit of fun, let's have a quick look at where you can see just some references to both Poe's poem and Plague Doctor symbolism in things we enjoy today. Well, for Nevermore and the Raven, it comes up pretty much everywhere in books, TV shows, films, and a whole bunch more. Here are just a few examples. In Lemony Snicket's A Series of Unfortunate Events, one of the books has a tree in the centre of the village called the Nevermore Tree, and it's covered with crows. I love Terry Pratchett as an author. His Discworld series has a talking raven named Quoth. One of the first things he says to any character he meets is that he won't say the N-word, and in the book he's always called Quoth the Raven. So Quoth the Raven Nevermore from the poem is basically just totally stood up there. In the 1989 version of Batman, Jack Nicholson's Joker quotes the Raven to Kim Basinger's Vicky Vale when he says, "Take thy beak from out my heart." As for The Simpsons, well, Treehouse of Horror has an entire segment dedicated to it. Marge appears in a painting as Lenore, Lisa and Maggie are angels, Homer is the protagonist, Bart is the Raven. In The Addams Family, Morticia uses the Raven as a bedtime story to her son Bugsley, reciting it more as a nursery rhyme. And if you're into wrestling, professional wrestler Raven takes his stage name from the title of the poem and often ends interviews by saying "Quoth the Raven Nevermore." If you're a MOBA fan, well, Nevermore the Shadow Fiend is a demon in Dota. Swain in League of Legends has a whole bunch of crows about him as well. And as for TV, the current series American Gods, this contains a slight spoiler, so skip a few seconds forward, maybe 10 or so if you don't want spoiling. Odin's association with ravens as his eyes and ears. He has two Odins called Hugin and Munin, representing his thought and memory. And these are in American Gods, as well as Odin as well. In HBO's television series Game of Thrones, of course, the Raven is used as a messenger. There's the three-eyed Raven appearing in Bran Stark's dreams to guide him on a quest, and then the members of the Night's Watch are of course nicknamed crows, due to them only wearing black. You know nothing, Jon Snow. Going with cartoony stereotypes, in Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the evil queen has a pet raven as her familiar, and in Sleeping Beauty, Maleficent has a loyal pet raven named Diablo. Finally, for any Warhammer fans out there, there are of course the Raven Guards, an original founding legion of Space Marines. They take inspiration from the Corvidae family, such as their beak-like helmets, black power armour, and the name of their Primarch, Corvus Corax. Thanks very much for tuning into this skin lore and origins video, where we've gone really deep into the story, origins and inspirations and potential ties between the Nevermore and Plague Doctor skins for Reaper in Overwatch. If you like this vid, do throw a like and share it, subscribe for more, and do let me know in the comments what you thought, enjoyed or didn't. It all helps me make videos better, and what skins or characters you'd like to see covered next. For more Overwatch lore explanation, cultural references and analysis with a bit of fun too, heroes, voice lines, interactions, maps, comics, animated shorts, world and more, do check out my Overwatch lore series and maybe subscribe to the channel if you like this kind of thing. Cheers to my supporters on Patreon. You make these longer to produce videos possible. If you'd like to see how you can help me make this kind of content from just $1 a month or however much you can tip in, do check out my Patreon linked here as well. Until next time, I've been Hammeh, take it easy.